I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. The Washington, D.C. City Council has been planning to vote today, August 1st, 2025, on a plan to redevelop the RFK Stadium and the adjacent land as the new home of the Washington Commanders football team. The proposal will cost the city government $1 billion. That money is to be borrowed and then repaid using an old tax levied when the city built the Nationals baseball park, and now is to be repurposed for the new RFK Stadium project. Last year, DC also offered a $500 million deal to keep the Washington Capitals, the hockey team, from leaving for Potomac Yards in Alexandria, Virginia. Yesterday, the Washington Post weighed in with an editorial opposing the current plan, arguing against any public subsidy for a private enterprise. This is hypocritical, of course, because Washington Post owner Jeff Bezos, when he was searching for the second headquarters for his company, Amazon, did receive public incentives to help make his decision. Bezos eventually picked Crystal City in Arlington, quite close, in fact, to Potomac Yards. Though many may claim to know, even with dead-on certainty, what generates economic development, there is considerable academic and political contestation over why capital and technology gather in one part of the world and not in another. Why did Silicon Valley become Silicon Valley? Why did Washington, D.C. see an incredible turnaround since the late 1990s, only to become stuck in a rut again? What explains the remarkable revitalization of downtown Silver Spring in Maryland, but the city of Rockville, over the same period, was unable to turn around its downtown into a buzzing town center? What explains consistent public support for large public investments, even when those investments have a 400% cost overrun, like the Purple Line? Are the benefits of large investments so mammoth that we come out positive no matter the cost? But why isn't there similar cost immaterial support for transit around the southern part of the Beltway in the Commonwealth of Virginia, which is now trying to give up transit rights on the Wilson Bridge in a not-so-subtle effort to force Maryland's hands on tolling its section of the Capital Beltway? There are theories about the rule of law, natural endowments, capital formation, anchor projects, distance to market, distance to raw materials, universities, human capital, immigration, technology, placemaking, crime, and of course, public investments. But all of it is economic history, available only in hindsight. We know that water transportation on the Potomac River was the reason why Georgetown and Alexandria were well settled long before Washington, D.C. rose from the marshes. But with each new project, we relitigate. Now it is the RFK Stadium in Washington, D.C. In preparation for the vote, the D.C. Council's Budget Office released analysis that the city in the long run would see greater revenues from the RFK redevelopment project if there was no stadium. That is, the entire project footprint was given over to mixed-use housing development. And now the DC Council Chair has proposed revisions that redirects sales tax receipts and parking fees back to the city. The city's investment of $1 billion would hasten the redevelopment, leading to a new stadium by 2031 and surrounding housing developments by 2036. In the no stadium scenario, the construction of mixed-use housing would start in 2035 and go on until 2046. I asked Yashim Sain, Executive Director of the research group, DC Policy Center, if this was a fair deal. Sain is a longtime public finance expert and used to work in the office of the Chief Financial Officer in DC, where she led a team scoring legislation being considered by the DC Council. Stay with us.
I Hate Politics is brought to you by UMBC's Political Science Program, where you'll learn to shape public policy, impact communities, and function at the center of modern society. Learn more at shadygrove.umbc.edu.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning, precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Washington, D.C. progressive rock band, A Shrewdness of Apes. Ian Mabley on vocals and guitar, Josh Pittman on bass, and J.R. Franks on drums. You can find their music at asoaband.com. Yashim Sain, welcome to Ahead Politics.
Thank you so much for having me.
The Office of the Budget Director in DC just released an economic analysis of the RFK stadium. What does it say?
It compares two scenarios. One is a scenario where there is a stadium and a mixed-use development around the stadium, as the mayor has proposed and the council is about to finalize. And the other is an alternative scenario where there is no stadium and the bulk of the site is dedicated for housing and other mixed use. Basically, what they are showing is that the stadium acts like an anchor and creates investments earlier than the alternative where there's no anchor, it's just housing development. So that starts bringing revenues much earlier because the investment is done much earlier, the construction is done much earlier. But in the long run, because the alternative, which is many more housing units, create new residents and income tax base. In the long run, the contribution of the alternative development without a stadium is greater for the city. That's something that the economists have said all the time, and the findings are not surprising. I would have approached it slightly differently. And they did a great job. First, this nonpartisan analysis from the Council Budget Office run by Jan Budov. She's fantastic and her team is fantastic. But the way I think about it is, I do agree with the premise that this kind of investment by the sports team and the city, the infrastructure investment by the city and the investment in the stadium and ultimately in the housing by the stadium does create an earlier start date because there's committed financing. The biggest problem we have right now in the city is you don't see any housing permits anymore. You don't see any new groundbreakings in housing. Investors are not interested in the district. Interest rates are high, and some of the regulatory concerns also push people out. So we're not seeing any new groundbreakings in housing. So one way to really ask this question might have been, how many years of difference between the groundbreaking under two scenarios would have yielded equal revenue? Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yes, so let me ask you this. First, let me just establish some facts. So the Office of the Budget Director is under the Chief Financial Officer's office. No? So tell me, is the Office of the Budget Director independent from the executive and the council?
No, the council's budget office serves the council. Technically, they report to council chairman, but the way that this office has been managed under its leadership is it's basically a resource for all council members. Their research is also driven by council member interests. So it's quite possible that somebody has asked them to do it. The office is not political, though. It's not elected. It's not, the head of the office has been there for a very long time under different leaderships. It's a very well-respected office.
This idea of short run and long run is interesting. So the stadium gets built in 2031. That's when it starts to produce revenue. But if you look at the no stadium scenario, the revenue starts in 2034. So there's a 3-year differential. So I'm not sure what this short-term, long-term kind of distinction is.
It starts, but it takes 10 years or so to develop.
If you look at the report, the delta between the no stadium revenue and the stadium revenue is not that much going up until 2043 when the inflection point happens and the no stadium revenues goes up significantly. There's a difference, not that marked a difference.
The reason the divergence becomes so stark in out years is all the housing units are built.
So I'm not sure it's the short run, long term, which is the report makes a big deal about that. It's 3 years difference, maybe 5 years difference at most. The other point that you were trying to make is that there are no permits being issued. There's very little housing activity. And so this precipitates building activity. I think that's correct. But the question is that at what investment? So there's $1 billion going to be invested in precipitating 3 years difference, 4 years difference. Is that a reasonable return on investment?
I did not read the study that way. There's a difference of 3 years in construction, but the yield is far out into the future. Like
the no stadium scenario and the stadium scenario, both are just chugging along until 2043. There's a difference, but there's not that much of a difference.
There's actually like a 10-year difference. If you look at the schematic on the very first page, the mixed-use construction is completed under the stadium scenario by 2036. In the mixed-use no stadium scenario, the construction completes at 2046.
But the inflection point is even before the construction is complete. So what difference does it, is this a real difference?
The real issue is, they made their assumptions as best as they can, given the charge that they want to fulfill. But the big unknown is, for example, will it really be 2033 when groundbreaking starts happening under a no stadium scenario? We are not seeing robust commercial development activity as we had seen before. The city still needs to commit to infrastructure. Like that $1 billion we're going to spend it one way or the other. So that's the cost.
You believe that infrastructure development for a no stadium scenario will also cost $1 billion. How so? What are they going to do that's going to cost $1 billion?
Roads, utilities. It's just an empty land right now.
But even if the stadium existed, you'll be spending that amount of money.
Correct.
But the return on investment on one is higher than the return on investment on the other. It's just literally a matter of a few years. Speak to the idea that maybe the development won't even happen if you didn't put the football stadium.
There is the revenue calculation. You make your assumptions, you crunch your numbers, you come up with the revenue. But that's not the actual number. What we should be looking for is the expected number. That's like the probability of something happening times the revenue you get from it. I think that's the most important thing that we need to wrap our minds around. What is the probability that this will happen under the stadium use scenario? The deal involves building of the stadium. We could call that close to 1. Like probability is close to 1. It will happen. The second part of it is mixed-use development on the land given to the commanders. I think the council's approach to it, putting some fines if the team doesn't meet the timelines in this construction, is a productive one. It's still not 1.
So what do you think is the probability? If it's like 80% or 60%, because that multiplier, you can measure that. Then you can measure net present value of both the scenarios. And
you have 2 variables. We know the revenue is fixed. The council budget office calculated that for us. But you have 2 variables. One is the timing, and the other is the investor interest. Both of them contribute to your probability. At any given time, you need to look at the investor interest under 2 different scenarios. I would not think of it as like 1 probability, but I can probably say that by 2026, that there will be investor interest in the alternative without a stadium is pretty close to 0.
Oh, okay. So you don't think that the alternative scenario actually exists?
The alternative scenario doesn't exist in 2026. And that's what the council's budget office did. They said they discounted that probability all the way to 2033, right? They said until 2033, we don't see enough investor interest for this to happen.
even if the stadium is built, and even if there are fines associated with key timelines on mixed use development, even if those things were to happen, there is a possibility that they may not be built because there is no market demand, or the pricing structure is off, or construction cost is too much.
And you carry that risk under both scenarios. I think what the council and the mayor is betting on is repetition of the success of the baseball park. Of the baseball park, it started in 2006. The city built it, actually. It opened in 2008. We're in 2025. There are still plots of land that has not been developed.
So why wouldn't that work with the stadium scenario?
It would, but it would equally apply to non-stadium scenario as well. The crux of the matter is, will an investment like this by commanders induce enough additional demand to build around it?
I think the question that Charles Allen and others that oppose this, the argument they are making is that it's not just a commander's investment, it is a public investment. And if it were only commander investment, this would be a no-brainer. Do it. But the issue is the public investment that backs whatever the commanders are going to do. And if the commander said we don't need public money, I mean, I don't think anybody would object.
Well, let me put it this way. If you want a significant housing development without a stadium, break ground in 2026, like the stadium would break ground, you're going to have to find much more public money than just the infrastructure investment. There is no investor interest. I understand the point. I think the point that I'm trying to make, look, I'm an economist. I know this literature on sports complexes and convention centers and all of that stuff. All I'm trying to say is, when you think of economic incentives, they're generally offered to bring something that's going to happen in the future closer to today. And the calculation is exactly the same. If we invest $1 million today, we'll start yielding revenue 5 years from now as opposed to 10 years from now. Is that $1 million worth it? That's the calculation, right?
But there's also return on investment calculation. There's also the difference between what if you did it and what if you didn't, what if you let things take its course. There is no doubt that is the intention. But you know the literature. Why is the literature wrong?
I'm not saying that I disagree with the literature. All I'm saying is most of those analyses do not incorporate the element of insurance. We provide subsidies for various developments all the time. We provided it for the Nat Park. We provided it for the Wharf. We provided it for Noma. We provided it, we did all of these things and created these neighborhoods out of nothing. Given the economic conditions that we are in right now, lack of demand, we keep an eye on the fundamentals all the time, as you know. The investor demand is so weak. And I'm agnostic, Sunil. I'm just trying to frame the question, not give you an answer. The question is simply this. Is $1 billion worth paying the insurance of having something break ground there in 2026?
Well, is it? I'm holding a mirror right to that question.
And honestly, I don't know the answer. If you asked me 10 years ago, 5 years ago, I would have said absolutely not. But now I'm really worried about the trends that we're seeing in the city. To me, the problem is even bigger than this. Like in DC, we are so used to this idea of growth by acquisition. Bring another team, bring another headquarters, bring more people in. But we really don't know what organic growth means. What is in our air? What is in our soil? What is in our water that makes the city grow? That's the focus of my thinking these days. So I look at this as growth, as acquisition, but I don't think in the long run that's a valid strategy. It's worked when the federal government was a tremendous attraction here. And I don't see that in any of this debate.
So that organic growth is the no stadium scenario. That's what the literature says. That's what your long-term preference is. But the stadium wins still.
But standing on the shoulders of what? It is the organic growth scenario, but where is it coming from? Is it coming from more people coming and working for the federal government? No. Is it more law firms moving into the city? No. When you think of DC, if you think of my calling card as DC, it says government town, right? Take out that government town on that calling card. What do you put on it? If we knew the answer to that, you could attach probabilities to the no stadium scenario much more comfortably.
This is a universal problem. Every jurisdiction in the United States and perhaps in the world faces exactly this problem, understanding and, by the way, not knowing what actually brings about economic development. It often is a lot of capital aggregation for reasons that have nothing to do with capital aggregation. It has to do with university or maybe waterway. Or if you look at economic history, why capital aggregates in one place and you get development here but not there is like an age-old question.
It is, and it's an important one. We actually have a paper coming out on this particular issue in September. We call it demand for DC, but it's not like the economist definition of demand, but like interest in the city and what we're seeing in terms of science, and examining this particular question of how to really invest in the infrastructure that can generate organic growth. We know that governments are not particularly good at picking winners. And most times when you see agglomeration effects, it happens by happenstance almost. Like look at Dal, right, in Georgia. And then, the sort of like you have developers of technology, where the benefits are very concentrated and almost there's a monopoly on them for a very long time. Like look at Silicon Valley. And then you have organic growth like retail in Seattle, but it also built on Seattle's proximity to Silicon Valley. You have all these kinds of models out there, but I think what governments can do is be agnostic about picking winners, but think about creating the environments which makes a city most attractive to residents, workers, businesses, investors, all of them. That's what the government can do. There's beyond that, not much.
I can't wait to read your report, first of all. But having said that, the government can't pick winners. But in this case with the stadium, the government is in fact trying to pick a winner. So how wise is that?
The need for growth is so dire in the city right now that investing $1 billion in XYZ economic development is not a bad idea. Although the yields are like, in either case, these are not solutions to our short-term problems. If you're struggling with the budget next year.
But you're cutting education, you're cutting environmental programs.
No, the way we're paying for this is through capital funds. So we're not spending $1 billion. We're borrowing $1 billion.
Still, there's debt service issue.
Yeah, there's a debt service issue. And what that is our debt service is capped at 12%, right? So whether you do this, we're almost at 12%. So we need to invest less in something else or
schools.
No, we're not.
Yeah, but capital expenditure in schools, you'll have to cut or rec centers or whatever.
I think bulk of the money is coming from what we call a baseball tax. We imposed a tax on businesses called the gross receipts tax, a baseball fee is what it's called. That's generated far more revenue, and it's like the baseball bonds are being paid off right now. We don't need that tax anymore.
That's right. How about removing the tax?
And then you don't have $1 billion.
If you want to stimulate organic growth, and one vision of that is to reduce the tax burden.
I am not opposed to it at all. But remember that you need that $1 billion, whether it's the stadium or all housing or all office, doesn't matter. You still need that. So again, these are incredibly hard choices. I think you want me to come out and say this is a terrible idea, don't do it.
I don't want you to do that.
I'm only focused on the probabilities here. That's what's missing in some ways. Well, I shouldn't say missing. That's very, very implicit in the Council Budget Office's analysis. They handle that by pushing the timing here or there. But I think those probabilities are very unclear.
So in the end, if probabilities are that hard to calculate, and you cannot calculate utility in that way, so even probabilistic utility, then is it just a value judgment? This is the larger problem that I was trying. So large public investments are value judgments. They are not utility judgments.
No, and think of it as insurance, right? You're buying insurance. You're paying $1 billion. You'll pay $1 billion either way, but you're cutting this deal with the commanders.
It's a risk. I'm not sure insurance it's a risk. It could work. It could not work.
Let me push back on this point of insurance to explain what I mean by this. Right now, we have the land and nothing else, right? We have rubble. And we don't have any plans to invest in it. We don't have anybody interested in it. Nobody has come and proposed an alternative to the city. We have nothing. Forget the commander's deal for a moment. How much would we pay to ensure that somebody will break ground by 2028?
My question is that even calculatable is what I'm saying. So, do you remember? Do you remember Silver Spring in the early 90s? I don't know if I remember. Silver Spring in the early 90s, even late 90s, was like not redeveloped, nothing. And then there was a bunch of folks that came and offered really big projects, amusement park and things like that. And those were all kind of not done. And eventually they found a way, they found a developer who would do what, comes about now. And it's been a phenomenal success. Yes, there is a value that you attach to getting early investment. Clearly, early money is very, very important in any kind of work that you do. But if you take the first money or the second money and you don't go for the long-term view, which the report says is mixed-use housing, there is more money, more organic development as a model, consistent with economic theory, all of that is there. But if you just rush into it in the belief that nothing else exists, and maybe you're right, nothing else exists, then have you created path dependencies that are less than optimal?
Yeah, quite possible. Governments do things that are less than optimal all the time. It's like one way to really increase the return, even with the stadium scenario, is just upzone the place. So the stadium you can still have your 20,000 residents and 10,000 units and the stadium. That's a possibility. Like, we're not even looking
at. What about that? That's my question. Well, why don't you do that?
That's a great question. And you have neighborhood pushing back and all of that stuff. And, these are like emotional decisions on so many levels. All I'm saying, Sunil, is that I push back that probability. Of course, you can calculate that probability. We calculate probabilities of all kinds of things across all, like, you go to Lloyd's of London and they will give you an insurance policy for that.
This is true. And actuaries do all of that. But it seems to me often that for ordinary citizens that are not experts, these probabilities are simply not calculatable. And then we are stuck with basically value judgments about whether you want the purple line or you don't, whether you want the stadium or you don't. So public investment is really vibes.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important point. And that's why we're in this debate that I really did not want to be any part of, because you're saying green is the best color and the other guy is saying blue is the best color. Like, this is an uninteresting debate for me. The crux of the matter is this investment a big enough inducement for earlier development and sure development, right? Because the place will develop eventually, but will it really break ground in 2033 as assumed by the council budget office? Maybe it's 2050. Like, we don't know. So is this deal? Yeah, it's not a $1 billion investment, but the important thing is the commander's deal has created the political will to find that $1 billion, right?
Well, so Charles Allen just also said he's opposed. Obviously, he's opposed to the whole thing, but he just said that the total cost is, and in fact, the report says that if you calculate the direct and indirect costs, it's close to $4 billion. Obviously, these are things said in the political context. And in the end, if you're going to make a vibe-based political argument, then you're also vulnerable to vibe-based political argument.
Again, in my view, the investment is about securing construction. It's important and it's worth something.
How do you know what it is worth? I agree. It's worth something. I do not disagree. How do you know what it is worth?
In 2031, it's worth $409 million a year. That's from the council budget office. And it's worth all of that stuff. The alternative, they're putting the alternative. But if you were to multiply that, let's say the probability of all of this happening with the commander's deal is 0.8. And the probability by 2047, I'm looking at their numbers. 2047, mixed use stadium, 1.7 billion, mixed use without stadium, 1.9 billion, right? Let's say with the Commanders, it's 1.8 because we already have an investment that are committed into this. And then without the stadium, let's say it's half of it, like 50%, 60%, 70%, like pick whatever. Either case, when you start multiplying those, all of a sudden the lines start switching, right?
Sure. No doubt.
And I'm not saying this is my estimated probability is right. The question that we should first ask is, what are the differences in estimated probabilities for these two to be equal in value? To me, making a value judgment over that difference is much, it's something I can put my arms around much easier than talking about revenue in 2060. It's the value of revenue in 2060 is zero. To me, it's worth zero.
Yashim saying, thank you.
It's always fun. And you always get me in trouble. Take care.
That's DC public finance economist Yashim Sain of the DC Policy Center.
Though we cannot see, hard to explain if you don't believe, makes itself known in the dark, leaves your heart racing cold and stark.
That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. Don't forget to tune in to our Tuesday morning news analysis. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, with support from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the universities at Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics, government, and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from Washington, D.C. progressive rock band, A Shrewdness of Apes. Ian Mabley on vocals and guitar, Josh Pittman on the bass, and J.R. Franks on drums. You can find their music at asoaband.com. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihbpod.org. I hope you will subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.